Well, well, live and see, as they say. Okay, so
Yep.
probably now I will introduce you in a more official way, actually. So, dear colleagues, first of all, I will tell you the title of David's talk. The talk is titled Dynamic Systems Theory, the Anthropology of Policy, and their Application in Sierra Leone and Elsewhere. And David Makeni is an associate of the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Halle Saale in Germany. He is also an honorary research fellow of the University of Durham in the United Kingdom and scientific advisor to the University of Makeni in Sierra Leone. As I have already noticed, originally David is an Irish anthropologist who has taught and researched in many countries, particularly in Ireland, in Eritrea, Sierra Leone, Germany, New Zealand, Russia, and the United Kingdom. His publications include the edited volumes, Biopolitics, Militarism and Development, Eritrea in the 21st Century, and the other one is titled Middle Classes in Africa. David's latest monograph is An Eritrean Village Reacts to Land Reform. David holds a doctoral degree from the Queen's University, Belfast, and was also educated at the National University of Ireland in Maynooth. He has published in, top anthropological journals like Current Anthropology, Studies in Ethnicity and Nationalism, Anthropology Today, the Irish Journal of Anthropology, and in several edited volumes. He has spoken at numerous international conferences and the United States State Department. His research interests include land reform and nationalism, biopolitics and human rights, education policy, and post-conflict reconstruction in Sierra Leone. He is currently developing a new research project on the Sierra Leonean reaction to the West African Ebola virus disease epidemic of 2014-2016 and its legacy for that country's successful response to the global Covid-19 pandemic of 2020-2021. Well, and as you can see by the title, David's topic today has quite a lot to do with the interests of our center, International Center of Anthropology, and of the colleagues who were so kind as to join us now. So, David, you're most welcome.
Okay, thank you very much, Dimitri. I'm going to use a PowerPoint presentation to do it that way. And before I do that, thank you for the very kind words of your introduction. And I'll speak for about 40 minutes. Will that be okay, Dimitri? And then we can take questions. 40 to 50 minutes?
Absolutely.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so let me know if I'm going on too long.
Oh, well.
And we'll start from the beginning. Let me see if I can just share this one. Yeah. And we start that way. Okay. So Dimitri has already told you about my various associations with Max Planck Institute, University of Durham, University of Makeni, Sierra Leone. The University of Makeni is Sierra Leone's first private university, and it's going to be important to the story I'm going to tell today. We'll come back to it in a few moments. The title of the talk is Dynamic Systems Theory, the Anthropology of Policy, and their Application in Sierra Leone and Elsewhere. I should say that the anthropology of policy is that branch, that subdiscipline of our discipline, which deals with policy as a socially and culturally embedded phenomenon. Policies are not fungible. They're not things that can be picked up and taken and used in contexts different from those in which they originally appeared, those socially and culturally embedded contexts. So, my qualification and experience: as an undergraduate, I was trained in the field of American cultural anthropology. As a postgraduate, an MA and PhD student at Queen's University Belfast, I was trained in the School of British Social Anthropology. I did my PhD on land reform and nationalism in Eritrea. Most people who worked on Eritrea can't work on it now due to the political situation in the country, due to the ongoing period of repression and human rights violations that have been taking place in the country since the end of the border war 20 years ago. A situation that has actually worsened since the outbreak of the war in the Ethiopian province of Tigray last year. I have other colleagues who work on, for example, Uganda. I work on Sierra Leone. These are very different cases from Eritrea, but they're not that different, arguably. I've also been at the University of Bayreuth. I worked on the project Middle Classes in Africa, taught medical anthropology at the University of Durham. Then, after teaching at Durham, I went back to the MPI, the Max Planck Institute, where I had a year-long project on language and nationhood in post-conflict Sierra Leone. One of the things I'm going to talk about today is how those issues of language, nationhood, their role in nation building, how they are relevant to problems of a world facing emerging infectious diseases and the epidemic, pandemic threats they represent. And it was since the Ebola epidemic of 2014 to 2016 that I began to pivot my research interests to the ways in which societies respond to Ebola and Covid-19 and other similar threats. Before I did that, though, I was part of the project to edit a book on middle classes in Africa, which is a major claim of media commentary on Africa in the past decade, was the apparent emergence of a Western-style middle class. As I and my colleagues said, this was something that did represent an engagement with a real phenomena in Africa, a real change in the African reality, but which was much more complex and complicated and much more African than everyone tended to assume. So, one of the reasons why everyone was so excited about the apparent emergence of middle classes of a Western style, it was usually implied, in Africa, was the assumption that once you have a middle class, you have an easier political situation, better economic situation. And once the middle class begins to rise and grow, you get a positive feedback loop in which political stability and democratization is enhanced and in which economic growth also takes on a better pattern than it had before. And that's relevant to issues like Ebola, issues like COVID-19, because those are issues of public health. They're part of the things considered by public health when it becomes part of the art and science of preventing disease, prolonging life, and promoting health through the organized efforts of society. That phrase, the organized efforts of society, is the potentially tricky one in that. Who is organizing society in this case? Is it society as a whole? Is it some group internal to society? Or is society being organized or disorganized by external influences, external threats, external pressures that it experiences as part of a world system? In Eritrea, my experience was that of a state-led nation-building project, which had an ideal of unitary national identity that would overcome religious and ethnic differences. It was an aggressive and militaristic nationalism, as we've seen for the past 20 years, and as we've seen in Tigray and the human rights violations occurring there since last year. Sierra Leone was a different story. The state was always weak in both colonial and post-colonial times. Nation building came after the Civil War of 1991 to 2002. After that civil war, Sierra Leonean society was demobilized and demilitarized. A new wave of nation building took place. It involved, amongst other things, the rebuilding of nation-state structures, structures of law enforcement, education, transport infrastructure, healthcare, revenue collection, etc. The various bureaucratic apparatuses that are essential to the operation of a modern 21st century nation state. But nation building also took place in civil society, as there began to be new debates over what constituted the Sierra Leonean nation. The lingua franca in Sierra Leone is Creole, a Creole language formed from English, local languages, and even some Arabic and Portuguese. And it's a language associated, first of all, with the Creole ethnic group, who are the descendants of the people who landed in Sierra Leone in 1787, the freed slaves, resettled black poor from London, who it was hoped would make in Freetown a province of freedom, an alternative to the slavery of the Atlantic world system at that point. The language of this community has gone on to become the lingua franca of the country, while the Creole themselves remain just 3% of the population. Part of the nation building, nation rebuilding that took place since 2002 has involved a reassertion of the Creole place within the nation by the Creole themselves. While at the same time, the restoration of multi-party democracy has involved competition between political parties, largely based on regional and ethnic blocs. The northern-based All People's Congress relies on the support of the Temne ethnic group. The southern-based Sierra Leone People's Party, who were returned to power in the last election, relies on the support of the Mende ethnic group. Yet there is still a Sierra Leonean national identity interacting with all these ethnic identities and with the religious identities of a country that is 50 or 60-40 Muslim and Christian. So Sierra Leone has a long tradition of higher education. It was known as the Athens of West Africa. It had Fourah Bay College from an early point during the British colonial period of the 19th century. This trained missionaries, lawyers, doctors, teachers, etc. Makeni, where I was based, was the capital of the northern Sierra Leone, a part of Sierra Leone which had traditionally been underserved by educational institutions. It was a country that needed more educational infrastructure, especially after the end of the Civil War in 2002, a time when the country was experiencing major problems resulting from the major devastation and destruction of that war. The University of Makeni was constructed by an initiative of people from the local Roman Catholic Church who believed that they could and would build the country's first private university with the intention of enhancing the educational level and educational opportunities in the country. It today still exists. It's still growing. It has a law department because the country still needs many lawyers. It even has a laboratory for tropical medicine, which came out of the Ebola crisis of 2014 to 2016, and which I hope to study in the near future. So one of the things the University of Makeni was dedicated to was the building of a new middle class in Sierra Leone, a new set of people with certain levels of education and certain values relating to a belief in the need for democratization, anti-corruption, nation building, etc. That was part of my 2019 project, Language, Nationhood and System. I looked at language policy in Sierra Leone. The official language of the country is English. The lingua franca is Creole. The various ethnic groups retain their own ethnically based languages. It is a linguistically plural society. And this creates a certain policy problem for the state. It creates a situation in which it's not clear that the official language will actually be accepted as the legitimate official language by the mass of the population. And this is a tricky subject when you're trying to go through a process of nation building, nation rebuilding, and national reconstruction. for that process to be effective, it has to be seen as legitimate. And one of the potential sources of illegitimacy might be the belief that the language of one's own ethnic group is not properly recognized by the state and by politics. I wanted to think about how that problem interacted with the problem of the reconstruction of national systems in Sierra Leone, the systems of law enforcement, transport infrastructure, healthcare, education, etc., that I spoke about a moment ago. And I published a lot of this in a recent working paper that came out of the Max Planck Institute, which you can find on the Max Planck Institute Halle website. And my new project, as I said earlier, is how a Sierra Leonean responses to the global and ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, influenced by that country's experience of the Ebola virus disease epidemic of 2014 to 2016. Is there a connection between this new project and my previous project? Well, there is, because both of them involve the deployment of nation-state-based resources. They both involve the use of a political apparatus to organize society in order to achieve those goals of the art and science of public health, or the art and science of language policy, as the case may be. They both involve the deployment of systems, most of all. So, how does my current research connect to my past research? The era of COVID-19 is the era of the end of globalization. It's the era when we definitively see the closing of the era that opened in 1989 with the end of history. It's a period in which we see a definitively emerging multipolar world order. It's an era in which Africa's relationship to the external world system is going to be a much more complex one, one that contains both opportunities and threats for the continent as a whole, and especially for its poorer, more marginal countries like Sierra Leone. The COVID-19 era is an era of public health responses, global but also national. It puts on the agenda the question of whether public health means nation building. Which is what brings me to a previous presentation on language and the reconstruction of nationhood in Sierra Leone and other post-conflict situations. Crisis, I argued, is an overlooked but necessary concept in any theory of language and nationalism. And it's also a necessary concept in any theory of global epidemics and public health responses. So to think about crisis in the relationship between language and nationalism is also a good way of thinking about the relationship between nationalism, nation building, the legitimacy of nation states, and effective public health responses. In Ireland, even though we don't mostly speak the Irish language, we do consider the Irish language to be still part of national identity and national heritage, even though the language has been in decline since the 1851 census. Cultural nationalism in Ireland has always involved a valuation of the Irish language. It was a key part of Irish nationalist agitation. Hutchinson proposed 3 stages of the Gaelic revival of Irish cultural nationalism. He proposed 4 stages, I beg your pardon. Gestation, it starts to grow, it becomes crystallized, becomes a mass movement with legitimacy in the eyes of the mass population. It goes along with religious reform, changes in the religious organizations, Catholic and Protestant, to which the majority of the population are allied. It has a socio-political articulation. It has political consequences for nationalist agitation and activism in Ireland before the nationalist revolution 100 years ago. There's just some examples of an Irish nationalist, cultural nationalist leader who went on to become the president of Ireland, Douglas Hyde, in the 1930s. More in cultural nationalism, Irish style there, with both the Irish and English languages represented. In the middle there you see Seachtain na Gaeilge, that's Irish week. And the Irish language becomes still a contentious political question in the north of Ireland, where today it was announced that in order to return power sharing to the Northern Ireland government, the main British government in London would insist on an Irish Language Act intended to boost the parity, the status of the Irish language in the north of Ireland. Language and politics in Africa are very much linked. Mozambique, for example, retains Portuguese as a language of agitation and propaganda even after Mozambican independence in the mid-1970s. Cameroon has political instability resulting from the fact that the Anglophone provinces of that country feel themselves to be neglected and underrepresented in the Francophone state. The reliance on these two European languages will be seen by Ngugi wa Thiong'o as a retention of colonial attitudes, colonial mindsets, which need to be decolonized by a reliance on African languages. These things all involve crisis. Crisis as events of ordering and reordering, improvisations and maneuvers, episodes when structural defects become manifest, a source of suffering that reshapes persons' lives and identities. And the definition of crisis there at the end is one from two Halle colleagues of mine, Christoph Cole and Anita Shroven. And they're talking specifically about the experience of crisis in Guinea, a country that neighbors Sierra Leone, and which has gone through extensive political crisis since independence, crisis which has a highly adverse, stressful effect on the populations who experience it. Crisis is an episode of systems. It's a concept with a long, complicated history. It's connected to modernity. You can see this, for example, in public health efforts against smoking. You can have a diagrammatic representation of the systems that produce tobacco as a problem of public health, in which various resources flow through various points. Resources such as the ability to impose anti-smoking legislation or to influence smokers' constituencies, etc. So dynamic systems are defined by the resources that flow through them, the ways in which the patterns of those flows are shaped by the systems themselves, and the concept of feedback is a highly important one, central to the concept of the system. Feedback comes in two versions. Negative feedback preserves the equilibrium of a system. Positive feedback disrupts that equilibrium. And this kind of thinking has been used by Eric Kaufmann in his paper on complexity and nationalism, published in Nations and Nationalism in 2017, which I would recommend to anyone interested in these kinds of subjects. He sees four pillars as forming the relationship between complex systems and the emergence of nationalism, the emergence of successful nation-building projects, whether they be in Ireland, Sierra Leone, or elsewhere. There is distributed knowledge, tipping points, emergence, and feedback loops. And here's what I wrote in the working paper I published with the Max Planck Institute last year. Tipping points are the points where changes of degree in a system suddenly produce changes in observable patterns. Large changes can result from small effects. They involve the mobilization of distributed knowledge, the accumulated reflections and interactions of individuals in relation to each other and the whole. And when this is activated, when this knowledge is activated within a population connected within a system, then we see feedback loops that reinforce tendencies such as the tendency that Kaufman cites to the rebirth of the Estonian language in post-Soviet Estonia, and which lead to the emergence of a changed, revised Estonian national identity. And of course, this has problematic consequences for the Russian-speaking communities in that Baltic Republic. Now, on the left there, you see an orrery, a mechanical representation, a model of how the solar system works. On the right, or my right, as I look at the screen, you see the British Marxist historian E.P. Thompson, who criticized Louis Althusser, the French Marxist philosopher, for producing a system that, rather than enhancing understanding of the world, of the social world, simply created a mechanical model that didn't actually represent the complexity of that world. That's something that should be borne in mind, I think, whenever anyone tries to use the kind of ideas, the kind of models that are implied in something like systems theory. And Thompson's book, The Poverty of Theory, I think is very valuable for anyone who's interested in those kinds of questions or interested in problems of social theory and history of any kind. Now, epidemics are caused by the interaction between human systems and natural systems. Viruses can lurk within host populations. Ebola is believed to have been present within a bat population somewhere in Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Liberia. Ebola was known in Central Africa, in Democratic Republic of Congo, and in Uganda. We still don't know how it got to the Upper Guinea coast. What we do know is that human pressure on the environment helped create a situation in which the virus could leap from animal hosts to human hosts, producing a epidemic of the Ebola virus in the human populations of Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Liberia. We can also have a systems perspective on COVID-19. We can talk about the ways in which the epidemic, the pandemic of COVID-19, as a biological phenomenon is spread through interpersonal contact, in which infectious people go on to infect others. We can also talk about the ways in which that's also a social, cultural, political problem, the ones in which, sort of problems in which trust in authorities can enhance or decrease the effectiveness of public health risk communication, and can enhance or decrease public performance of protective behaviors. One very important part of the current COVID-19 pandemic as it exists in Africa is that even though there have been African countries which have had bad experiences with the COVID-19 viruses, we have not seen anything like the kinds of death tolls that were predicted for the continent at the beginning of the global pandemic in the spring of 2020. Some authorities were predicting millions of deaths across the continent as the COVID-19 virus spread through populations that lived in very close proximity to each other and who were poorly served by underdeveloped healthcare systems. In the event, this kind of apocalyptic scenario has so far failed to emerge. Sierra Leone suffered some deaths due to COVID-19, but it did not suffer anything like the scale of deaths it experienced during the Ebola viral disease epidemic of 2014 to 2016. That's the problem I intend to focus on in the research that I'm hoping to be able to carry out in the very near future. I'm hoping to be able to think about, research the resources that Sierra Leone was able to draw upon to guard against the kind of truly catastrophic outcome that it experienced during the Ebola virus disease epidemic 5 years ago, and the catastrophic outcome that was predicted for Sierra Leone and many other African countries from early 2020 onwards. And what I think is that those resources can be best understood as social and cultural resources derived from the experience of Ebola virus disease and embedded in the kinds of institutional social structures, social networks that are represented by the, for example, University of Makeni. As the country's first private university, it has a certain relationship to the new Sierra Leonean state that's emerged over the past 20 years, but it's independent of that state. It's independent of a state and of a political establishment, which is deeply mistrusted by the Sierra Leonean population at large. A major problem in the dissemination of counter-Ebola education projects in Sierra Leone was that very many sectors of the population were skeptical about the claims made in 2014 about the looming threat of the Ebola virus disease. Many people were prone to dismiss the threat of Ebola as a scam or even a hoax perpetrated by the political establishment, by persons in government, in order to acquire external aid and external funding. As we know, Ebola turned out to be very real, and I believe that Sierra Leone has been, in a way, collectively vaccinated against the social and cultural factors that might have opened it up to Ebola that might have opened it up to COVID, I should say, in the current global situation. So I'm afraid I've finished earlier than I suspected, Dimitri, but I hope that will give us more time for questions. It's probably late in Moscow right now, but as I say, this current research project is in its infancy, but it does build on my past experience, my past research in other areas and other parts of the world. So if anyone has any questions or comments, I'd be very interested to hear them.
Well, David, thank you very much. Thank you very much. So, well, it's not too late in Moscow for asking questions, at least. So, and everyone is welcome to do it. So, any questions for David? Maybe comments? Please unmute yourself and just speak. Well, while colleagues are thinking, I shall say that what I saw as a very interesting and promising, well, attempt in your paper is how you tried your best to interrelate, well, different, actually seemingly very different kinds of problems, health problems related to the Ebola, pandemic like that, on the one hand, and the problems of language on the other, how you interrelated them while discussing the problem of nation building in the country. And what was very interesting for me is that you mentioned not just building, but something like, I put it down, rebuilding and reconstruction of nations, actually. Well, because actually it is often argued that we have never had nations in Africa, and that they are just in the process of building, which seems to be constant sometimes.
It seems to be what? Sorry?
Constant. Well, constant, without having no end. Having no end.
Ending, yes.
Time is passing and they are still in the process of nation building, you know. So, but anyway, so the problem of reconstruction, the rebuilding of the nation in Africa is what I see as a very, very important point. And returning to my main point, well, I did admire how you found a link between health problems and language problems. Well, and that link is the problem of nation building and rebuilding, and how you related all that stuff to dynamic systems theory,
Yes.
Well, and actually, well, as we talk about language as a tool in nation building in Africa, I think we should not overlook at least one example of, in a sense, successful use of a language, an African language, I mean, as a means for nation building in Africa. I mean, of course, Tanzania with Kiswahili, the Swahili language, which was and still is very, very purposefully and consciously used by those in power from Guerrero up to the current leaders of the country, just for the sake of nation building. Well, of course, there were some clear and favorable preconditions for that. Well, but what we have today is that in Tanzania, well, first of all, actually 99% of the population speak Kiswahili, speak the Swahili language. For most of them, it is the mother tongue, which shapes their national identity atop their ethnic, what they call tribal identities. Well, it is very important. Well, according to many linguists, languages of many ethnic groups in Tanzania are on the brink of eviction, actually, of disappearance, especially of smaller groups. But at the same time, their ethnicity, their ethnic identity still persists. Well, and it is not it is not undermined completely by the national identity, which forms, as I said, atop ethnic identities. And what they told me actually every time I asked them about it is that the Swahili culture, and particularly the Swahili language as the core of that culture, is what unites them into the nation. Well, and this is a very important, there is a very important division between countries like Tanzania, which are in a clear minority among other African countries, and most of the African countries, which are, as you said, talking about Sierra Leone, are multilingual. And of course, Tanzania is also multilingual, but they have an African, a local language as a clear and possible background for national unity. While in most African countries, including Sierra Leone, they have to rely on a European language, actually the language of the former colonial power. it raises problems of its own. So I think that if you continue working in this direction, the example of Tanzania can be very, very demonstrative for you. I think, especially if you compare it with Sierra Leone.
Yes, I think so. With regard to the Tanzanian experience of language and nation building, it was very much state-led, and not just by the obvious means of state education, but also through interventions in popular culture.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. And to popular culture and to, in a sense, historical memory.
Yes.
Because what happens there in reality is that, the Swahili language is the language of a actually small ethnic group, which is small even today, coastal ethnic group. And only in the 19th century, closer to the end of to the turn of the 19th century, and basically due to the efforts of European missionaries, who began to teach at their schools, missionary schools, and to perform sermons in the Swahili language. So due to that, the language spread all over what is called Tanzania today, especially the mainland part, former Tanganyika.
Okay.
Well, but also, of course, the language has got a lot of influences from the Arabic language.
Yes.
But what is very important is that for actually each and every Tanzanian, it is a local language, which is to which spread they are not obliged to the colonizers. And this is what was instilled, the idea that was instilled by the government from the Nyerere time. And what is also very interesting is what kind of nation has been built upon it. Actually, late Jan Blomert wrote about it very well. That that in fact, the nation is the state in this context. Loyalty to the nation is actually loyalty to the state. The state is central for this nation. And in a sense, it substitutes the nation in the sense which was born in Europe, say, by the end of the 18th century, I shall say. So that's it. But in any case, of course, we have a reason to talk about the variety of nationhoods in a sense, right? Is the European model of nation the only possible, like that? But in any case, what I wanted to emphasize is that, the situation in Sierra Leone is actually typical for Africa. While the example of Tanzania is, I shall not say unique, maybe unique, I cannot say it right now, but at least a very rare case. And in countries like Sierra Leone, they do not have another linguistic background other than the language of the former colonial power. And this is a kind of an asset, maybe a kind of an asset.
Yes.
For example, there in Zambia, what I studied, since the 1990s, I think, they began to emphasize their diversity, their linguistic and cultural diversity. Yes, as an advantage of their nation. So much depends on the way the government approaches such issues.
Okay. I don't disagree with anything there. Those are all very to the point and correct comments, I think. With regard to Tanzania, the obvious connection is that Tanzania is one of the countries that was hard hit by COVID-19, even losing its president to the disease. So that might be a point of comparison with Sierra Leone, which had some linguistic similarities. Creole is not the same thing as Kiswahili, but it does have a comparable place within the national identity, within everyday life, etc. And Kiswahili is a coastal language. It emerges in a part of Tanzania that's heavily connected to the outer world, to all the centuries-old networks of trade that go across the Indian Ocean and beyond. Am I right in thinking
Right.
that?
Of course,
Yeah.
of course.
Okay, that's very, very comparable to Creole, which is a language that emerges out of the history of the Atlantic slave trade. And you can see this in the vocabulary. Like a machete, a very standard tool for a farmer in Sierra Leone. In Creole, it's called a cutlass, which in 18th century English was a sword that a naval captain would have. The floor of a house is a deck in Creole, like the deck of a ship. So there's an obvious legacy of the Atlantic slave trade right there in the language people speak every day. And that historical connection to an external world system is paralleled by the contemporary everyday connections to the world system that we saw in both the Ebola virus disease epidemic and we're seeing in COVID-19 today. So those would be the major things I think of in relation to Tanzania as a comparative case. The other major thing is that you're right in saying that everyone thinks, Africa is a deviation from a European model of nation building, nation creation. There are no nations in Africa, arguably. But the thing is, in Europe as well, we can count many deviations from what we assume to be the European norm of nation building. You could look at the Irish Revolution 100 years ago and Irish political separatism as an example of a failed nation building project. The nation in this case being the British nation, which was supposed to be a collective identity, a collective unit transcending the national identities of England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, but which proved unable to integrate one of those identities into this transcendent national identity, and is today beginning to lose Scotland, Wales, maybe Northern Ireland as well. Catalonia in Spain, southern Italy, its separatism. I even heard the last time I was in Dusseldorf, people talk about North Rhine-Westphalia becoming independent. And they were maybe joking, but it's interesting they would even joke about that sort of thing. So, yes, I agree entirely with what you've said, and I think it's going to be a good springboard for further development of the research project I'm engaged in, and I hope might help people develop their projects as well. So,
well, as for the European nation,
yes.
as I see it, well, we have two things at least. On the one hand, we have something like a model, an ideal nation. Well, the ideal model, yes, in which each and every big corporate, cultural entity, cultural unit, can be called ethnic group like that.
Yes, yeah.
Has its own culture, of course, which differentiates it from others. Well, and political institutions, independent state, nation state. Yeah. Well, as a political form of political organization of that cultural unit, which represents a civil society.
Yes.
Civil society. Yeah. And in reality, of course, we have many such big corporate groups, cultural groups, have never had or had only periodically some form of independent nation state, like Catalonians, for example, right? Yeah. Well, but what is even more important is, as I see it, is that nowadays, even that ideal model seems to be outdated, and this is a clear legacy of post-colonialism, I shall say.
Okay.
Because, well, what was the central idea of the nation initially? That nation integrates people who share the same culture, the same values.
Yes.
And today, as you know better than I do, well, that in the West, the idea is that people should be tolerant to different cultures.
Yes.
And to form a nation, to be a nation, means to recognize cultural variety as a norm, right? Yeah. Well, today, for example, French and the British are not just people of French and British cultures. Well, because we have, for example, well, French, say Nigerians and people of African or of some African origin, and British people of the same origin, yes, who have their own cultures. They do not share, well, the British or the French culture, well, as we can realize them, yes. But they are French and British. Well, this is one point. And also, you said that that today we are witnessing the end of globalization, in the sense we well, witnessed the end of history, right? In 89. Well, of course, it always depends on what we understand as under globalization. Well, I think that what once again we see an end of a definite model of globalization, or even better, definite model of not globalization as such, but of understanding of globalization. Because in my view, anthropologists' view, well, globalization is a cultural process with very deep, long history. And actually, it's a process of more and more intensive intercultural interaction up to the moment when the whole world, cultural world, has come in interaction with within all its parts. So, well, at the beginning, only the neighboring well, communities communicated. Then the process broadens that scope, and up to the present day, when every nation can communicate with every nation. And this is today is irreversible, of course. Irreversible. This is that way. So from this standpoint, well, globalization has not finished. People will continue. People of different cultures will continue to communicate. But what we can see is the crisis of actually equating of globalization to the Western model of a free market, economic market, well, and correspondingly political democracy, like that. At this point, I think we can recall the ideas of, first of all, Eisenstadt about the multiple modernities, his idea of multiple modernities. Well, he expressed at the turn of the 20th century. Well, this is one point. And coming to the most theoretical issue you raised about the dynamic systems theory, its application to the evidence from Sierra Leone and elsewhere. Well, maybe I'm mistaken, but if I'm not mistaken, it seems a bit strange that you did not relate this theory to the theory of institutions. Yeah, because actually, when we are talking about dynamic systems, right? What are the integral parts of those systems? If we are talking about societies, I think we do not have any better idea than to recognize that societies or cultures as systems, although they are of course not closed, but in any case, the systems consist of institutions. So, and then we can talk about the dynamics of these systems as dynamics of institutions in the course of their interaction with each other and their interaction with the outside to this that cultural system world. So,
okay, that's a very good point. I'd be very interested in any literature recommendations you have on that. I didn't include it in my talk, but I have read some of Herbert Simon's book, Administrative Behavior, which is an economic managerial text about management decision making within certain types of institutions, which I think has some relevance to that point. And with regard to the system being composed of institutions, again, that's very, very true. I think the ways in which systems influence institutions most of all is the effect they have on the individuals who make them up by subjecting them to certain types of stress, certain types of disruption of their psychological or even physiological equilibrium, because this may have the effect of throwing institutions into turmoil, facing them with outbreaks of crisis, episodes of crisis that require reordering of their internal institutional structures, their patterns of institutional behavior, and their patterns of interaction with the wider society and the wider world beyond. With regard to globalization, a very important part of globalization as we saw it over the past 30, 40 years was what David Harvey called time-space compression, in which advances in transport technology and global communications would have the effect of cutting down the time needed to traverse areas of space. Travel time between countries and continents would decrease. Communication time between countries and continents would decrease. This would lead to an acceleration of global economic, social, cultural activity, and to an acceleration of the global integrations we called globalization. One thing I think was very significant about the Ebola epidemic of 2014 to 2016 is that the countries of the Upper Guinea Coast, Sierra Leone especially, which had been experiencing time-space compression through, for example, the entry or the re-entry of mining multinationals into Sierra Leone, suddenly found that this acceleration was suspended and then reversed. I think what we can observe in this case is an episode of time-space decompression, in which even though the technologies for rapid communication and interaction across regions and continents still exists, that technology is no longer used. It's suspended because of the outbreak of an epidemic disease, for example, in an affected country. And that country is affected not only by the disease, but also by a sudden disrupting influence, a sudden source of crisis within that society. So time-space decompression as a concept doesn't seem to have been used much by people writing on globalization, but I think it's something that we did see in the Ebola epidemic 5 years ago, or the epidemic that ended 5 years ago, I should say, and something we're seeing now in the global pandemic. Even the reopening of the world hasn't been a accelerated event. And even the countries that did try to accelerate the reopening have found it may have been premature. So, yeah, institutions are important. So too is the speed at which institutions act are forced to act by their particular context. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Of course, it's a very good point. And I also noted what you said about, well, the role of just humans in this process. Yeah, that because really, well, when we are talking about, well, institutions, their interaction, their forming a system or other systems within a bigger system, well, we should understand that how it happens actually. These institutions are filled with people who act within these institutions, and what is very important is that in complex societies like any contemporary society, each and every person acts within a big number of institutions, yeah,
Mhm.
and people
Mhm.
interact within and across institutions,
Mhm.
yeah, and
Mhm.
this is how this process is taking place. So
Mhm.
they're well integrated in groups, formal and informal, so on and so forth. So, well, we should not, on the one hand, I think, forget that, well, we actually, when we are talking about systems in social sciences like that, we are talking about people, actually, yeah?
Mhm.
Well,
Yes.
and on the other
Yeah.
hand, we should not anthropomorphize. We should not anthropomorphize institutions. We should not
Yes.
think that there are some, well, entities per se, which act just, that they have some will, to act and so on and so forth. All we have, what we have is the outcome of activities and, well, desires of different people who are pursuing their actually personal own interests, but in the course of pursuing them, they are moving, I shall not say over the head, but in some directions.
Mhm.
They're changing and moving in some direction their societies and as systems. This is how I see it.
Mhm. I agree completely. That was one of the things I found most worthwhile in the work of Gunter Schley, for example, his focus on the individual as the creator of institutional life and of social interaction.
Yeah, this is also important for the discussions about nationhood. For
Yes.
example, just recently I participated in a discussion if there is or there is no collective identity, or are there only individual. So this is something that has implication in philosophy since the Middle Ages, realism versus nominalism. Yeah,
Mhm.
uh, do only separate things exist, or do well general notions exist too? So, and from this standpoint, yeah, of course, we can recall, well, imagined identities and so on and so forth.
Yes.
But if we look at Sierra Leone, yeah,
Mhm.
so today, can you tell us what if we approach, well, common Sierra Leoneans, yeah, on streets, and ask what makes you Sierra Leonean? What will they answer? Or maybe they will answer that they just more people of their ethnic groups, for example, than of the nation, Sierra Leone nation. So how do you think?
That's a good question. And I have to be honest, I don't know the answer. It's not a question I've ever put to a Sierra Leonean person. One thing I found very surprising as an Irish person was the ways in which people relate to the legacy of the British Empire in Sierra Leone. English is a prestige language still, not just an official language. Popular culture in Sierra Leone involves, for example, the broadcasting of British television programs. And I even saw a soldier wearing the poppy badge, which is not something you would ever see in Ireland, but which in Britain commemorates the dead of the First World War, and which apparently is still something that would be worn in Sierra Leone as well. And I don't think that this is simply the retention of a colonial mindset. I think this is more a creative use of the past in order to not only claim a relationship with Britain, but also to claim status within the society. The Creole were only 2% of the population, but they were very keen on cultural tropes associated with Britain and British identity in the past. So another point, however, would be the memory of the Hut Tax War of 1898, in which leaders in what is now the interior of Sierra Leone tried to revolt against British rule before having a protectorate imposed on them by force. That's also another episode that becomes part of the national myth or nation building Sierra Leone as a whole.
I see.
So,
yeah. Well, by the way, when I was studying, well, Africans in the United States, well, I noticed that some Sierra Leoneans, well, emphasized in talks with me that they were more, in a sense, civilized than other Africans. And they said, we have British manners. Well,
yes.
Well, yeah, something like that. Well, we are more influenced by the British culture, they used to say. And when I asked, what do you mean? They said, on the one hand, that we, for example, have some British traditions, like 5 o'clock tea, for example. And on the other hand, they said, well, due to our, well, attachment to the British culture, we are more than other Africans interested in getting education, for example.
So,
well, it is not a question of how true such arguments are, but it is important that people, some Sierra Leoneans did realize themselves as people of, in a sense, British culture, and they saw it as something what distinguishes them from other Africans in the positive sense.
There's a parallel there with Eritrea and its relationship to Italy. Italian language classes were very heavily subscribed when I was in Asmara. And Eritreans are intensely nationalistic and proud of their national independence, but they did certainly carry on some Italian cultural practices as symbols of civility or even civilization. So, that may be an under-examined question when it comes to post-colonial Africa.
And also, by the way, in America, the Caribbeans also, well, also applied to the British culture, well, as something very positive for them, what they have acquired and what distinguishes them not only from Africans, but also from African Americans. Because they associate Britishness with civility, in a sense, with good manners, well, with proper behavior, like that. So when they say we have acquired Britishness, they mean that they are good-mannered and good-natured persons. Well, that's it. So, dear colleagues, maybe someone else would like to intervene, well, and to penetrate into our talk with David.
If possible.
Yes, of course. Yes, of course.
Спасибо большое. Well, thank you very much. A few ideas on all these connections. First of all, about the nation and nationhood. There are two interesting distinctions between two different ideas of nationhood that I used in my work, which is a state nation and a nation state. We all know what a nation state is. The state nation is something completely the opposite, which is obviously a state consisting of many nations and trying to exist as a single nation. So that is one thing. The second thing that I found very interesting, when we speak about cultures, I'm not sure about what anthropologists and how anthropologists interpret culture in the Sierra Leonean context. But in terms of East African anthropological research and South African anthropological research, the culture is a very contested word. A culture is a very contested word. What is a culture? For a very long time, until very recently, South African anthropologists would absolutely kill you if you said something like traditional culture or a Zulu culture or something like that, because the cultures are invented. They are artificial. They are certainly not traditional or nothing like that. it is only recently that actually people who represent these sort of ethnic groups, I don't take the risk to say cultures, but ethnic groups, linguistic groups, if you want, that they have started to study and to research not even stress. People in the street certainly do stress their cultural identity, ethnic identity, not only linguistic identity, but anthropologists do not. Because what is interesting to me is that culture, how is it expressed in the institutions and how these institutions transform, change and evolve. These three sort of notion, culture and institution, and the transition, and in this connection, how much is it invented, how much is there is some sort of a dragging residue of the centuries. So that is, to me, a very interesting question. And in this connection, of course, South Africa is a very complex and a very, very interesting society to look at from that point of view, both from the point of view, the interrelation of cultures, interrelation of languages, political interrelations of cultures, languages, and institutions. And to what extent is it a shared society or a common society, and to what extent is it just a multi-ethnic society? This is a really interesting question to me. I think that finally, just one small word about Swahili. Swahili, of course, is I don't think it was created or spread inside Tanzania by the colonial authorities. They've just taken it over, they took it over. But it was brought to the interior of East Africa, definitely by slave trade. And if you look even now, what is happening is that Swahili is spread in the areas, irrespective of colonial borders, but in Eastern Congo, in Northern Mozambique, and much less so in Kenya for some reason. And the reason is that there was only one slave trade route through the southern through what would be the southern Kenya. And there are several, if I remember correctly, 3 such routes or 4 such routes through Tanzania into Eastern Congo. And there is one such route, but a very powerful one in what would be the northern Mozambique. So that is a very powerful legacy, of course. Thank you.
Okay, and thank you for those interesting comments. With regard to institutions and their role in creating identities, the institution in Sierra Leone that I'm most familiar with is the University of Makeni, which is under the patronage of the local Roman Catholic Church. And it's a church that has many followers in Makeni, but it's in a largely Muslim part of Sierra Leone. The missionary work of the church has produced a local cadre of local priests, religious believers, lay people, etc., under the official Catholic line of what they call enculturation, of adapting what they see as the universal message of the religion to the local cultural situation. So you have a change in identity in this part of Sierra Leone over the past 70 odd years, in which a new religious identity emerges, that of being the member of the local Roman Catholic Church, but it's a religious identity rooted in local cultural standards, local cultural ideas, etc. So with regards to South Africa, in the South African case, you have a state nation that, as I understood it, was trying to create pseudo nation states within it in order to preserve the racial supremacy of a white settler colonial population. And that this is the source of the kinds of impositions of identities that people object to when they hear the words like Zulu culture, etc. In Sierra Leone, it's a colonial situation, but it's a very different one from that of the white settler colonies of Southern Africa. The British Empire needed the port of Freetown as a coaling station for its ships, for its naval power at the end of the 19th century. They even used Freetown to go to the Falkland Islands in 1982. British naval ships bringing the troops there stopped in Freetown in the run-up to that war. It also needed to control the hinterland, the protectorate, the interior, and so on. But there was never any white settler colonialism there, so colonial authority, colonial rule took a different pattern in this case. You didn't have an aggressive attempt to create a sort of colonial state nation here, at least not as I would see it. So I hope that responds adequately to your comments. You look skeptical, Professor Filatova.
Well, the only skepticism is that I do not quite agree with the point that South African state nation was sort of necessarily, well, the attempts to recreate it exist even now. They actually exist in every African state which can be considered multi-ethnic. The problem is to work out which sort of state it is going to be. Because it is certainly not a nation state, which is a one nation state, but it is a state nation, what is a nation within the same borders. I do remember the Zambian slogan, for example, with which the radio programs started every day, United Zambia, Zambia United, United Zambia, Zambia United. That is, United Zambia, United Nation, the nation united.
Yeah.
So the meaning, that is exactly what is meant by the state nation. So in South Africa, just as everywhere, whether we consider Afrikaners to be colonizers or now a legitimate group within the South African population, it doesn't matter anymore because it's not the Afrikaners who are creating that state.
Yes.
Thank you.
So the I think the problem of a pluribus unum out of many one exists everywhere in Africa, but it can always be handled differently. Your point about United Zambia, United Nation reminded me of the Eritrean slogan in Tigrinya, Hade Hezbi, Hade Lebi, one people, one heart. And this is part of a attempt by an authoritarian political regime to create a nation state out of roughly 6 to 9 ethnic and ethno-religious groups. Ethiopia took a different route, a federalist route, a nation of nations under the rule of the federal state nation. And that has broken down very badly within the past 6 months in Ethiopia, partly as a result of Eritrean intervention. So, yeah, these are things all worth thinking about. Yes, I hope to go on thinking about them in the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Well, dear colleagues, any other comments, questions for David? Well, if there are no any other comments or questions, I would like to say thank you to David once again. It was my And I think for all of us, it was our great pleasure to have David with us today, to listen to him, to talk with him. Well, and I shall say, of course, that David is not just a wonderful anthropologist, but is a very dear friend of mine. So it's my pleasure even more to see David now. Well, so dear friends, well, I thank you all for participation in our seminar. And so have a prosperous and nice summer. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Despite
Спасибо большое, коллеги.
Спасибо, David. Спасибо.
Спасибо.
До свидания.
До свидания.
Goodbye.
Пока.
Goodbye. Всего доброго.
Yeah.
Goodbye.
Cheers.
Cheers. Спасибо большое всем.